I think this is a big turn in policy, and it's very welcome. And I think Vladimir Putin has finally worn out the patience of this president, which is a good thing and a long time coming. So I hope that now the U.S. backs this welcome statement by President Trump with action. If you look at what the Biden administration did, they gave over $66 billion in military and other assistance to Ukraine. The President Trump and his administration have not said no to that. Now NATO will pay for those arms. They're just starting to flow. I think $1 billion has been released, but that's obviously too little, too late. We need to do more faster to actually give the Ukrainians what they need to win back, maybe not all the territory, but even some of the territory, to put themselves in a better negotiating position. Because as we've learned with Vladimir Putin, you don't get anywhere unless you get there from strength.
Well, that's right. And so I'm curious what type of strength the president is referring to here. Donald Trump writes, Putin and Russia are in big economic trouble, and this is the time for Ukraine to act. Is he talking about a military offensive or some sort of economic maneuver that we're not talking about?
Yeah, I can't speculate on what the president meant, but Russia is in big economic trouble. They have put their entire economy on a war footing, so that's artificially propping up GDP growth. I do think, even though it was a little ham-handed to just punish India, the idea of really trying to do our best to crack down on some of these Russian oil exports, to put on maybe some limited secondary sanctions. It's hard to get those to work perfectly, but the idea of putting more pressure on Putin is very welcome. And I also would say I really welcome the president's remarks about NATO airspace sovereignty. As you know, Putin sent a bunch of drones over into Poland. That was not an error, as you and Nick discussed. I think the Poles reacted right in exactly the right way. Denmark, it's a little less clear. And Putin does this perfectly. He always tests and tests and tests until somebody pushes back hard. So I'm glad we're pushing back.
Well, how far should we push back? President says you ought to shoot them down. You get MiG-31s in your airspace, you shoot them down. That's also a pretty good way to start a war, correct? The Russians are pretty good about implying different motives when they're caught in the act. Our fighter pilots for decades have been intercepting Russian Bear bombers and fighter jets in airspace over Alaska, for instance. Should we be shooting down Russian jets if they incur an Article 4 as opposed to 5 offensive here?
Look, I think you leave this to the NATO planners and strategists. Obviously, we stick to NATO Article 5, which means an attack on one is an attack on all. So far, what you've seen from the Russians is incursions via drones, not so much manned jets. So I think the idea that NATO is standing together, I thought the Europeans did really well this summer when you had Mark Rutte from NATO and a bunch of European leaders show up at the Oval Office to say, basically, we stand with you, America, we stand with you, Ukraine. And that's kind of the strong symbolism that Vladimir Putin needs to see.
We heard from Vladimir Zelenskyy today at the UN. It was his chance to speak from the same speaker's rostrum that we saw Donald Trump in yesterday. He spoke to the veracity of institutions, and there's been a big conversation about that this week. Certainly, President Trump tried to engage in one yesterday as he chastised the UN for doing little more than writing strongly worded letters. So I want you to hear what President Zelenskyy had to say earlier today, and we'll have you respond. Let's listen.
Even during bloodshed, there isn't a single international institution that can truly stop it. That's how weak these institutions have become. What can Sudan or Somalia or Palestine or any other people living through war really expect from the UN or the global system?
If you're having a hard time hearing that on the radio, he was referring to Sudan, Somalia, or Palestine, any other people, he said, living through war, what they should really expect from the UN and the global system. Do we expect too much from this institution holding its General Assembly this week?
Yeah, I think international institutions are only as powerful and effective as its members allow them to be. And the United Nations is a collection of member states. And so if the most senior leaders of that on the Security Council disagree, obviously the UN is hampered in its effectiveness. But I would say, look, the US attacking the UN as being ineffective is not new. We also still foot a large part of the bill. And to echo what President Zelenskyy said, the UN does an enormous amount of good. They deploy 70,000 peacekeepers around the world. The World Food Program feeds 150 million people a year. The World Health Organization coordinates responses to big public health outbreaks. So there are a lot of things that the UN is doing, even if it may not be possible for that institution to solve the biggest wars unless its members permit it to do that.